The night Hannah Whitaker fed a starving child. She had no idea someone was watching. She had wrapped the last piece of cornbread in her apron, slipped out the back gate of the Bellamy estate, and walked 3 miles through mud and darkness to reach the old poorhouse on Crow's Road. The child, a girl, maybe 6 years old, ribs showing through a threadbare dress, grabbed the bread with both hands and didn't say a word. She just ate. That was the moment Cole Ryder stepped out from the shadow of the oak trees. He had a rifle in his hand and suspicion in his eyes. He'd been tracking what he thought was a thief working the back roads. What he found instead stopped him cold. But before we go any further, if stories like this speak to something in you, something about people who give everything while the world looks the other way, then hit that subscribe button and stay with us to the very end. Drop a like and tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. It means the world to us to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Hannah Whitaker had learned early in life that being invisible was sometimes the safest thing a woman could be. She was 29 years old and had been working as a governess in the Bellamy household for 4 years. She taught the 2 youngest Bellamy children, a boy named Frederick, who preferred throwing rocks to reading, and a girl named Iris, who cried every time Hannah tried to correct her penmanship. Hannah taught them geography, arithmetic, and how to write in complete sentences. In return, she received a small room off the kitchen, 3 meals a day that were always whatever was left over after the family ate, and a wage of $6 a month. It wasn't much, but it was enough to live on if she was careful, and if she didn't spend too much of it on bread, medicine, and candle wax. The Bellamy estate sat on the eastern edge of Carver County, Virginia, where the good land flattened out into something almost gentle before the ridges and pine forests swallowed everything to the west. It was 1882, and the territory was in the middle of its 3rd consecutive dry summer. Creek beds had cracked. The corn had come in short and thin. Families who had managed through worse seasons were starting to sell off livestock, then tools, then land. Poorhouse on Crow's Road had been built a decade earlier as a temporary facility. It had never stopped being used. Hannah had first gone there in the autumn of 1879, when she'd heard from a feed store clerk that a woman named Bess Connolly had given birth alone in one of the poorhouse back rooms, and had nothing, not a clean cloth, not a candle, not a jar of clean water. Hannah had taken a pillowcase, filled it with what she could spare, and walked out there in the dark. Bess Connolly had looked at her like she was a ghost. "Who are you?" Bess had asked. Hannah hadn't known what to say. She'd set the pillowcase down, helped with what she could, and left before sunrise. She hadn't told anyone, not a soul. That had been 3 years ago. Since then, every Tuesday and every Friday, without fail, Hannah made her deliveries. She bought what she could afford with her own wages and supplemented it with careful, cautious acts of redirection, leftover food from the Bellamy kitchen that would have gone to the slop bucket, half-used bottles of medicine from the storage shelf that nobody checked, bolts of fabric that were set aside as too worn for the Bellamy children, but were still good enough to keep someone warm. She left everything at the poorhouse door with a note folded in half. On the outside of every note, she drew the same small image, a tiny bird, wings open, mid-flight. She didn't sign her name. She didn't want credit. Credit would have meant attention, and attention would have meant questions, and questions would have meant the Bellamys finding out she was using their leftover cornmeal to feed people they never bothered to acknowledge existed. So Hannah stayed invisible, and the people at the poorhouse started calling their mysterious benefactor Little Wren. She heard the name once, secondhand from a feed store owner who mentioned it casually while she was buying dried beans. He said the poorhouse folks were grateful to whoever Little Wren was, and that whoever it was must be some kind of angel walking among them. Hannah had paid for her beans and walked home without a word. Angels didn't exist on the frontier. She knew that well enough. What existed was hunger and cold, and a long list of people who needed something that nobody was providing. Cole Ryder had built his ranch on the northern stretch of Carver County with his own hands, his brother's help, and a stubbornness that people in the territory still talked about 20 years later. He was 43 now, with a jaw like a fence post and eyes the color of dried creek mud. Not attractive, exactly, but the kind of face that made people feel like he'd already survived whatever was coming. He stood just under 6 feet, moved like someone who'd spent his whole life trying not to make noise, and had a reputation that spread in 2 directions. People who knew him said he was fair, and people who'd crossed him said he was immovable. He had never married. He had never wanted to. He had come close once, when he was 30, and a woman named Clara Dietz had made him feel, for about 4 months, like he might be capable of something softer. Then Clara had gone east to marry a railroad man, and Cole had gone back to work. And that had been the end of that particular experiment. The ranch ran cattle, bred horses, and kept 7 full-time hands on payroll, more than any other outfit in the county. Cole had a reputation for paying fairly and expecting hard work in return, and his men stayed with him. He didn't socialize much. He attended the county assembly once a year because it was expected of him, sat near the back, said little, and left as soon as the business was done. People respected him. Few of them really knew him. The thing they didn't know, the thing Cole had never spoken aloud to another living person, was why he'd worked himself half to death building something this large. His sister Margaret had died in the winter of 1871. She'd been 22, newly widowed, and living in a rented room in a town 20 miles north of the ranch. She'd gotten sick in December, the kind of lung sickness that started as a cough and turned into something worse. Cole had sent money when he could. He'd tried to get there when the weather broke. He hadn't gotten there in time. What stayed with him, what had never left, not in 11 years, was that 3 different people in that town had known Margaret was sick and alone, and not one of them had done a single thing about it. They'd been busy. They'd had their own problems. They'd figured someone else would step in. Nobody had. After Margaret died, Cole had made himself a quiet promise. He would not be the person who looked away. If he saw someone struggling, he would help, not loudly, not with announcements, but in the practical way that actually made a difference. He'd quietly paid the doctor's bill for a ranching family that got wiped out by fever. He'd bought 3 horses from a widow at above market price and called it fair dealing. He'd rebuilt a fence line for an elderly settler who couldn't do it himself and told the man a neighboring ranch hand had done it as a courtesy. Nobody knew. Cole didn't want them to. He understood the difference between helping because it needed doing and helping because it made you feel important. The night he found Hannah Whitaker on Crow's Road, he was riding the fence line on the eastern edge of his property, which ran parallel to the road. He'd been tracking signs of someone moving through his pasture at night for 2 weeks, not stealing cattle, not trapping, just moving through. A set of tracks too small for a man, too regular to be accidental. He decided to wait them out. He hadn't expected a woman in a plain gray dress carrying a cloth sack, moving through the dark with a calm, purposeful stride of someone who had done this 100 times before. He'd followed her to the poorhouse, stayed back, watched. He watched her knock softly on the door and hand the sack to a hollow-eyed woman who looked like she hadn't eaten a solid meal in 3 days. He watched her pass a wrapped piece of bread through the gap to a child inside. He watched her check something in a small notebook she pulled from her apron pocket, nod to herself, and turn to leave. She almost walked directly into him in the dark. Hannah stopped, drew in a breath, didn't scream. Cole held up his free hand. "Easy. I'm not here to hurt you." "Then lower the rifle," she said. He hadn't realized he still had it raised. He dropped the barrel toward the ground. The 2 of them stood there in the road. A lantern from inside the poorhouse threw a thin line of yellow light under the door. Somewhere inside, the child was eating. "You've been crossing my land," Cole said. "I know." She didn't apologize for it. "Your fence has a gap near the birch stand. Been using it. I'll find another way if you want me to. He studied her face. She was looking back at him with the kind of steadiness that made him feel like he was the one who owed an explanation. How long? He asked. 3 years. He looked at the poorhouse door. The faint outline of the sack she'd been carrying, now empty. Every week? Twice a week. Who knows? No one. Cole rubbed the back of his neck. The night was warm and still around them. Crickets started somewhere in the grass and then went quiet. You work for the Bellamys, he said. It wasn't a question. He'd recognized her from the county assembly the previous spring. She'd been sitting at the far edge of the room with the household staff, and he'd noticed her because she was the only person there who seemed genuinely disinterested in the social maneuvering going on around her. I do, Hannah said. Does Robert Bellamy know you're out here? A small, dry pause. No, and I'd prefer to keep it that way. Cole thought about that. He thought about Margaret. He thought about 3 people in a small northern town who had looked away. Gap near the birch stand, he said finally. I'll make sure it stays open. Hannah looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression, not quite surprise, but something close to it, like a door she'd expected to be locked, had swung open on its own. Thank you, she said. She walked past him and back up the road without looking back. Cole stood in the dark for a long time after she disappeared. He didn't approach her again for 2 weeks. When he did, it was deliberate. He rode to the Bellamy estate on a Tuesday morning under the pretense of inquiring about a boundary survey that he and Robert Bellamy had been quietly disputing for 6 months. He knew Hannah would be in the kitchen garden with the children. At that hour, he'd paid enough attention to know her schedule. He found her exactly there. Frederick Bellamy was throwing a stick at a fence post. Iris was sitting in the dirt, ignoring the grammar primer open in her lap. Hannah was weeding with focused efficiency, dirt on her hands up to the wrists, hat pushed back from her face. She looked up when she heard his horse. Cole dismounted, tied the reins, and walked over. Miss Whitaker, Mr. Ryder. She didn't seem surprised to see him. I've been thinking, he said. That's generally considered a good habit. He almost smiled. Almost. The medicine you're bringing out there. Where are you getting it? She hesitated just briefly. I buy what I can. The pharmacist in town lets me pay in installments. That's coming out of your wages. Yes. How much? That's not your business, Mr. Ryder. He wasn't offended. Deserved that. I have a contact at the county medical office, he said instead. They have a surplus of field dressings and quinine from last fall. I could have a crate delivered to the poorhouse without anyone connecting it to either of us. Hannah set down her trowel and looked at him directly. Why would you do that? Cole had thought about how to answer that question. He'd run through several versions. In the end, he settled on the one that was true. Because it needs doing, he said. And I can. She was quiet for a moment. The sound of Frederick's stick hitting the fence post punctuated the silence at irregular intervals. All right, she said finally, but I keep track of everything that comes in and goes out. Document it. If something goes wrong, I want there to be a record. Agreed. And no one finds out it came from you. He nodded. Same goes for you. She picked up her trowel. Then I suppose we have an arrangement, Mr. Ryder. Suppose we do. He walked back to his horse. Behind him, he heard her go back to the weeding without missing a beat. Cole Ryder rode home, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't sure what to call it, but it sat differently in his chest than anything had in years. What neither of them understood yet was that invisible things had a way of becoming visible on the frontier, especially when someone powerful was looking for them. Robert Bellamy was a careful man. He kept his household accounts in a locked ledger, managed his servants with the precise coldness of someone who considered human beings a category of resource, and paid very close attention to anything that moved through his county without his knowledge. He had begun to hear about little Wren the previous spring, just whispers at first, the kind of thing that drifted through the county like smoke before a fire. Someone was helping the poor. Someone was organized about it. Someone who apparently had no official standing was quietly doing what the county commission had been failing to do for a decade. Robert Bellamy did not like that. It wasn't the charity that bothered him exactly. It was the implication underneath it, that someone without land, money, or social position was exercising a kind of influence he couldn't account for or control. Put his housekeeper on notice to watch the staff. He started asking quiet questions. The answer came to him on a Friday morning in October, 3 weeks after Cole Ryder's visit to the kitchen garden. The housekeeper came to Robert's study with a small folded note and set it on his desk without a word. He opened it, read it, and sat very still for a long moment. The note contained 4 words and a small drawing. The drawing was a tiny bird, and Robert Bellamy finally understood where little Wren had been sleeping all along. He folded the note slowly, placed it back on the desk, and reached for his pen. He had some letters to write before the county assembly next month. Hannah Whitaker had no idea that the ground she was standing on had just shifted completely beneath her feet. Robert Bellamy was not a man who acted in anger. That was the thing people misunderstood about him. They saw the expensive suits, the controlled voice, the way he could cut someone down at the dinner table with a single sentence delivered in the same tone he'd used to ask for the salt, and they assumed he was cold-blooded, calculated, a man who made decisions the way a chess player moved pieces, without feeling. That wasn't quite right. Robert Bellamy acted in self-interest, and self-interest in his experience required patience. He sat with the folded note for 3 days before he did anything. He went about his business, attended a land meeting in town, supervised the harvest accounting, hosted a supper for 2 neighboring ranchers and their wives. He was pleasant at the supper. He complimented his wife's choice of tablecloth. He laughed at the right moments. And the whole time, in the back of his mind, he was building something. Not a plan exactly, more like a structure. A sequence of events that would unfold the way a properly laid fence line unfolds 1 post at a time, each one set firmly before the next one goes in, until the whole thing stands on its own, and nobody can easily pull it apart. County Assembly was 6 weeks away. That was his timeline. He wrote 3 letters on the 4th day, one to Judge Alderman Price, who ran the county commission and owed Robert a substantial and undocumented favor from a land dispute 3 years prior. One to Martin Aldridge, who owned the county's only newspaper and had accepted Robert's advertising money for going on 8 years, and one to a woman named Cordelia Voss, who had the kind of social standing in Carver County that functioned like gravity invisible, inescapable, and capable of pulling everything in a room toward whatever direction she was facing. He didn't put anything explicit in any of the letters. He was too careful for that. He simply mentioned that he'd recently become aware of certain irregular activities connected to charitable organizations in the county, that he had concerns about the integrity of the people involved, and that he expected the upcoming assembly would be an appropriate venue for a frank community discussion. He sealed the letters, handed them to his man Gideon, and went back to his ledger. Structure was going up. Hannah didn't know any of this. What Hannah knew was that the crate from the county medical office had arrived at the poorhouse on a Wednesday, delivered by a man who said only that it was a donation from an anonymous source, and handed over the paperwork without any further comment. The woman who ran the poorhouse, a tall, worn-out widow named Ada Marsh, who had been managing the place for 6 years on an operating budget that should have been twice what it was, had opened the crate and stood there for a full 30 seconds without speaking. Hannah had been there when it arrived. She'd ridden out that morning on the pretext of delivering Frederick Bellamy's completed arithmetic exercises to a tutor who lived 2 miles past the poorhouse road, which was true enough, though she'd timed the trip carefully. "Quinine," Ada said quietly, turning a bottle over in her hands. "Real quinine. I haven't had a full course of quinine to give anyone in 4 months. Came with dressings too," Hannah said, "and a tin of carbolic." Ada set the bottle down and looked at Hannah with an expression that was not quite suspicion and not quite gratitude, but something in between, the look of a woman who had learned not to trust good things arriving without explanation. You know anything about where this came from? Anonymous donation, Hannah said. Ada studied her for a moment. She picked up the bottle again. Well, Anonymous is welcome here any time. Hannah rode back to the Bellamy estate feeling, for the first time in a long while, like the weight on her back had shifted slightly. Not gone, just redistributed. She thought about Cole Ryder more than she wanted to. Not in the way she would have felt embarrassed about. She was too practical for that, and too tired most evenings to entertain anything that wasn't directly useful. She thought about him the way you think about something that doesn't fit neatly into the category you've assigned it to. He was a wealthy ranch owner. She'd met enough of those to know their shape. The assumption that their time was worth more than yours. The particular way they looked through people who didn't own land. The generosity that always came attached to some expectation of return. Cole Ryder didn't fit that shape exactly. He hadn't asked her anything about herself. He hadn't told her she was doing a remarkable thing, or that she was brave, or any of the other things people said when they wanted to make charity feel like a performance. He had simply identified a practical gap and offered to fill it. She found that harder to distrust than kindness would have been. Cole, for his part, was dealing with his own complications. The arrangement with the county medical office had been simple enough to set up a donation, a contact, a request made without fanfare. Doing it had required Cole to be more deliberately aware of Hannah Whitaker's situation than he was comfortable with, which meant thinking about the Bellamys more directly than he generally cared to. He knew Robert Bellamy the way everyone in the county knew him, by reputation and by the occasional necessary interaction. They weren't enemies. Cole was too large a landowner for Robert to dismiss, and Robert was too well connected for Cole to ignore. They existed in a state of mutual, carefully maintained distance, like two fence lines, running parallel, never crossing, never quite meeting. Cole didn't like him. He'd never been able to put precise language to why, but it had something to do with the way Robert talked about people who worked for him. Not cruel, not explicitly contemptuous, just absent. Like household staff existed as furniture existed, necessary, replaceable, and not worth considering beyond their function. Hannah had been working in that house for 4 years. Cole thought about that on a Thursday evening, when he was sitting on his porch after supper watching the sky go dark over the northern ridge. He thought about what it took to spend 4 years being treated like furniture and still walk 3 miles twice a week in the dark to feed people you'd never met. He thought about what kind of person that required you to be not perfect. He didn't think that, because he'd seen the way she'd looked at him when he'd shown up on her road unannounced. Flicker of something sharp and defensive before she'd gotten it under control. She was not a woman without fear. She was a woman who moved forward despite it. That distinction mattered to Cole in a way he couldn't fully articulate. He got up from the porch and went inside and didn't think about her anymore that evening, which was not the same as not thinking about her. The trouble started 3 weeks before the county assembly, and it started small enough that Hannah almost missed it. The Bellamy household had a rhythm. She'd lived inside it long enough to know its textures, which mornings Robert Bellamy was in a cutting mood, which evenings his wife Clara spent too long with the decanter in the sitting room, which days the housekeeper misses. Pratt was moving through the house with a particular tightness around her eyes that meant she'd received some instruction she didn't like. The household had a temperature, and Hannah had learned a temperature, and Hannah had learned to read it the way a farmer reads weather, not because she could change it, but because knowing what was coming gave her time to prepare. The temperature changed on a Tuesday in late October. It wasn't anything dramatic. It was the way Mrs. Pratt looked at her when she came in from the kitchen garden. A glance held a beat too long, a small, almost imperceptible pause, before answering a perfectly ordinary question about the children's supper schedule. Hannah registered it and said nothing. 2 days later, she noticed that the storage shelf, where she'd occasionally supplemented her deliveries, had been reorganized. The items she would typically have considered surplus, the half-used bottles, the fabric offcuts, the candle ends were gone. The shelf had been cleaned, and restocked with full new items, arranged with unusual precision. Someone had been paying attention to that shelf. Hannah went back to her room after the children were in bed and sat on the edge of her cot for a long time. She was not the kind of person who panicked easily. Panic was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. But she let herself feel the shape of what might be happening, because pretending a problem wasn't there had never once made it smaller. If Robert Bellamy had figured out who little Wren was, he wouldn't confront her directly. That wasn't how he operated. He would construct something. He would make her a problem that appeared to solve itself. The question was what he was building, and how much time she had. She thought about going to Cole Ryder. She pushed the thought away immediately. She hadn't survived 4 years in this house by asking someone else to carry what was hers to carry. But she pulled out her record book, the small, brown-covered notebook she kept hidden inside the lining of her second-best dress, and she went through every entry. Every delivery, every item, every date, every quantity, the source of every supply, every dollar she'd spent, and from where it had come. She checked the columns 3 times. Everything was there. Everything was documented. If someone wanted to accuse her of dishonesty, they would have to do it in the face of a meticulous paper trail. Closed the notebook, put it back, and lay down on her cot with her eyes open. She didn't sleep much that night, but she didn't panic either. Cole found out about Robert Bellamy's letter-writing campaign from an unlikely source. His ranch foreman, a compact and permanently sunburned man named Dutch Farrow, had a cousin who worked as a typesetter at the county newspaper. The cousin had mentioned, in passing, at a family supper, that Martin Aldridge had been talking to someone about running a piece on irregularities in county charitable operations before the assembly. Dutch had mentioned it to Cole the following morning. While they were going over the fall cattle count, in the offhand way Dutch had of delivering significant information, as if it were a minor detail he happened to be, including for the sake of completeness. Cole had put down his tally sheet. "What kind of irregularities?" he said. Dutch shrugged. Cousin didn't know. Said Aldridge seemed pretty pleased about it, though. You know how he gets when someone with money tells him to be pleased about something. Cole knew exactly how Aldridge got. He'd watched it happen twice before, both times when Robert Bellamy had needed a particular narrative to land in the county's collective consciousness before a commission vote. He'd dismissed it then as not his business. He stood there now with his tally sheet in his hand and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite alarm, but had elements of both working their way through him simultaneously. "Finish the count without me," he told Dutch, and walked back to the main house. He needed to think, and then he needed to do something he should have done 3 weeks ago. He saddled his own horse. He almost always saddled his own horse. It was one of the habits his hands had long since stopped finding unusual, and rode to the Bellamy estate. He didn't use the front gate. He went around to the service road on the eastern side, which he knew from boundary surveys ran close to the kitchen garden. It was a Saturday morning. Hannah would be in the garden. She wasn't. He waited 15 minutes, sitting on his horse in the thin October shade, before he heard footsteps on the gravel path. She came around the corner of the garden wall with a basket over one arm and stopped when she saw him. She looked at him for a moment and then said, "You have that expression men get when they want to tell you something they think you're not going to like. That obvious? To me it is." She set the basket down against the wall. "Tell me," he told her. He kept it concise. Aldridge, the letter. A probable connection to Robert Bellamy, the assembly in 3 weeks. He didn't editorialize. He gave her the information and let her do what she wanted with it. Hannah listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "I just didn't know how far along it was." "How did you know?" "The storage shelf got cleaned. Mrs. Pratt started watching me like she was keeping score." Cole nodded slowly. "Do you have documentation? Records of what you've been doing out there?" "Every delivery for 3 years. Dates, items, costs, sources." She paused. "The medical supplies you sent are in there too. I logged them as an anonymous donation. I didn't put your name. That's fine, he thought for a moment. The trouble with going to the assembly is that it's Robert's territory. He sets the room. He decides who speaks and in what order. I know that. If he presents accusations first, and you respond second, you spend the whole time defending yourself. Hannah picked a dead leaf from the edge of the basket and turned it over in her fingers. Then I need to change what he's presenting accusations against. If he's accusing little Wren of deception, I need little Wren to not be a mystery anymore before he gets the chance to define her. Cole looked at her. You'd have to tell people who you are. Yes, in front of everyone, including people who work for Robert Bellamy. Yes, she dropped the leaf. It's terrifying. I'm not pretending it isn't. But I've been carrying this alone for 3 years because I thought staying invisible was the safest thing. And I think what's about to happen is what invisibility costs. There was a long pause between them. A horse shifted somewhere in the distant stable. The October air was cool and smelled of cut grass and coming rain. I want to help, Cole said, with more than a crate of medicine. Hannah looked at him steadily. Why? It was the same question she'd asked him in the kitchen garden. This time he had a different answer. Because Robert Bellamy has been doing this kind of thing for 20 years, and nobody's pushed back on it properly, Cole said. And because I have the means to, and I've been in the habit of looking the other way when things aren't directly my problem. I'm tired of that habit. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, If I tell you what I need, will you listen? Not take over. Listen. Yes. Then here's what I need. She picked up her basket. I need time to go through every record I have and prepare for the worst version of whatever he's planning. I need a legal mind, someone who can tell me if what I've been doing crosses any county ordinance. And I need to know whether the families I've helped are willing to be known. Because I've protected their privacy for 3 years, and I won't use them without their permission. Cole nodded. I know an attorney in the county seat, Thomas Greer. He's worked against Bellamy before and won. Can you get him here without Robert finding out? I can have him come under the cover of a boundary dispute. Robert already knows we've been in a survey disagreement. It won't raise any flags. Hannah considered this. All right, he said. She walked past him toward the house, then stopped, looked back over her shoulder. Mr. Ryder, Cole. A beat. Cole. She said his name like she was just deciding whether it fit. I appreciate you riding over. You didn't have to. No, he said. I didn't. He watched her go inside, then turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. The 3 weeks between that conversation and the county assembly were some of the most careful weeks Hannah had lived in recent memory, and she had lived some very careful weeks. She continued her Tuesday and Friday deliveries without any change to her routine, because changing her routine would signal awareness, and signalings would signal that she was afraid. She was afraid. But she delivered the bread and the medicine and the carefully documented supplies the same as always, and she drew the tiny bird on every note, and she smiled at Ada Marsh and asked after the children by name. She met with Thomas Greer on 2 occasions. He came to the Bellamy estate under the cover of the boundary survey, which was real enough that Robert Bellamy didn't question it. Cole had kept the dispute going at a slow simmer for months precisely because a legitimate legal matter was the best cover a man could have. Greer was a thin, precise man in his 50s who wore the same brown coat at both meetings and had a habit of asking the same question in 3 different ways to make sure he'd understood correctly. He went through Hannah's records with the kind of thoroughness that would have been annoying if it hadn't been exactly what was needed. After the second meeting, he sat back in the chair Cole had arranged for him in the small side room of a neighboring property and said, Miss Whitaker, I cannot find a single thing in these records that violates any county ordinance, statute, or law. What you've been doing is entirely within your rights. The items you've taken from the Bellamy household are items explicitly discarded as waste, and you've documented each one. Your donations were entirely self-funded. Your activities were conducted on public roads and public-facing charitable property. But, Hannah said, Greer tilted his head slightly. But law and reputation are not the same thing. You can be entirely clean and still be destroyed in front of a crowd if the crowd's been prepared to see you a certain way. I know. Hannah folded her hands in her lap. That's why I'm not going to wait for him to tell them who I am. She had spent the previous week carefully, quietly visiting the families she'd helped over the years. Not all of them. Enough. She'd explained what was coming. She'd asked, one by one, whether they were willing to be known. Some of them said no, and she thanked them and left and didn't press. Others said yes, with a directness that had caught her off guard. A few of them with something that looked close to relief, like they'd been waiting for someone to give them permission to say it out loud. 7 families. 4 women who'd been at the poorhouse, 2 men who'd received medical supplies during illness, 1 young man whose younger siblings had eaten Hannah's bread through a winter that had nearly broken the whole family. 7 was enough. Cole, for his part, had been doing his own quiet work. He had his attorney draft a legal document establishing a permanent charitable foundation assets, governance structure, a designated board, a deed transferring a portion of land adjacent to the poorhouse to be held in trust for community use. He'd funded it himself without publicity, in amounts that were significant but not so dramatic as to draw attention to their source. He hadn't told Hannah about this yet. He'd been uncertain how she would take it, whether she would see it as help or as him stepping in front of something that belonged to her. He was still working that out. Dutch Pharaoh, who observed his employer with the particular attentiveness of a man who'd worked closely with someone for 12 years, watched Cole drafting documents one evening and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "You're in it now, aren't you?" Cole didn't look up. "In what?" "Whatever this is." Dutch gestured vaguely. "This thing you're doing." Cole signed the last page of the foundation document and set down his pen. "I should have been in it sooner." Dutch nodded slowly. "That woman at the Bellamy place," he said. Not quite a question. Cole didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. 6 days before the county assembly, Robert Bellamy made his first public move. Martin Aldridge's paper ran a short piece, not an accusation, not anything that could be directly traced back to Robert raising questions about the origins of charitable donations in the county. The piece was vague, carefully worded, and designed primarily to plant a seed. The idea that whoever had been operating as Little Wren might have motives that were less charitable than they appeared. The word manipulation appeared once, without a direct target. The phrase undisclosed sources appeared twice. Hannah read it on the morning it ran. She'd gotten hold of a copy through Ada Marsh, who'd sent word by the son of one of the poorhouse families, a 12-year-old named Peter, who had the ability to appear anywhere in the county without anyone paying him the least attention. She read the piece twice, folded the paper, set it on her small table. Then she opened her record book, picked up her pen, and spent the next 4 hours writing the clearest, most detailed accounting of everything she had done over the past 3 years, dates, amounts, names of recipients where those recipients had given her permission to use them, and a precise description of every item she had ever taken from the Bellamy household waste and its documented disposal status. She signed it with her name, her full name, Hannah Eliza Whitaker, not Little Wren. She sent Peter back to Ada Marsh with a note that evening. The note said simply, "Be ready." 6 days, and 6 days later, she dressed in her good gray dress, the one with the record book hidden in the lining, and walked into the Carver County Annual Assembly with her head up and her hands steady and every documented piece of evidence she owned folded carefully in the bag over her shoulder. She was the most afraid she'd been in years. She walked through the door anyway. The room was already full. Robert Bellamy stood near the front, speaking to Judge Price, his posture carrying the comfortable ease of a man who has arranged the furniture of a room to his own advantage and is simply waiting for everyone else to sit down in the places he's chosen for them. He looked up when she entered. His expression didn't change. That was the tell, not surprise, not hostility, just a very small, very controlled absence of reaction. the face of a man confirming something he already knew was going to happen and had already accounted for. Hannah met his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she found herself a seat near the front, on the end of the row, where she could see the whole room and be seen in return. She was not going to sit at the far end of anything today. Across the room, near the back, she found Cole Ryder standing with his arms crossed and his hat in his hands, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He gave her one short nod. She turned back to the front and waited. The assembly came to order. Judge Price welcomed everyone. There was a brief review of county business road repairs, water rights at the North Fork, the usual litany of things that needed doing and weren't getting done. And then Robert Bellamy raised his hand with the relaxed authority of a man who has never been told to wait, and said that he had an important community matter to raise before the body. Judge Price said, "Of course," and gestured for him to proceed. Robert stood up. He was a tall man, well-dressed, and he had a voice that carried without effort, the voice of someone who had spent his whole life in rooms full of people and had never once doubted that they should be listening to him. He began to speak, and Hannah sat with her bag on her lap and her hands completely still and let him build his structure post by post, one careful sentence at a time. She already knew how to take a fence apart. Robert Bellamy spoke for 11 minutes. Hannah counted. She had nothing else to do with her hands while he talked, so she counted the seconds in her head, the way she used to count fence posts on the road to the poorhouse, methodically, without emotion, just keeping track of where she was in the distance. He was good at it. She had to give him that. He never raised his voice. He never pointed at her directly. He constructed his case the way a skilled carpenter constructs a box, 4 walls, a floor, a lid, each piece fitting precisely against the others, so that by the time he was finished, the shape of what he'd built was self-evident to everyone in the room. He began with concern. He was concerned, he said, about the integrity of charitable operations in the county. He was concerned that certain activities conducted without oversight or transparency might be doing more harm than good to the community's understanding of how aid should properly be organized and distributed. He was concerned that unnamed individuals had been operating in ways that, while perhaps well-intentioned, raised serious questions about their motives and their honesty. He never said Hannah's name. He never said little Wren. He didn't have to. Cordelia Voss, sitting 3 rows from the front in a dark blue dress that probably cost more than Hannah made in 4 months, turned in her seat and looked directly at Hannah for a long moment. Then she turned back to face Robert, with the small, composed expression of a woman who has just identified the relevant party and filed that information away for later use. Judge Price, at the front of the room, was nodding along with the careful attentiveness of a man who has been told in advance which direction the wind is blowing and has arranged himself accordingly. Robert moved from concern to evidence. He produced a copy of Martin Aldridge's newspaper piece and read 2 paragraphs from it aloud, not because anyone in the room hadn't already read it, but because hearing it read aloud in an official setting gave it a weight it hadn't had on paper. He referenced the fact that charitable supplies had been moving through the county without proper accounting. He raised the question, just the question. He was careful to frame it as a question of whether items belonging to private households had been taken without the knowledge or consent of their owners. That was the sharpest piece. Hannah had known it was coming, and it still landed with a particular sting, because it was the accusation most likely to stick even with people who were otherwise sympathetic. Theft was theft. The frontier was unforgiving about it. Several people in the room had shifted in their seats. A rancher named Webb, who Hannah had never spoken to directly, leaned toward his wife and said something in a low voice. His wife looked at Hannah and then quickly looked away. Robert concluded by calling for an official county commission inquiry into the matter and suggesting that any individuals connected to these activities come forward voluntarily and submit themselves to review. He sat down. The room was quiet for about 4 seconds. Judge Price started to speak. Hannah could see him, drawing breath. getting ready to move the proceedings in whatever direction Robert had arranged for them to go, and Hannah stood up. She didn't ask for the floor. She simply stood, and something about the way she did it, not aggressively, not dramatically, just completely, and finally made Judge Price stop with his mouth open and the room go still. "I'll save the commission the inquiry," Hannah said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "My name is Hannah Whitaker. I am the person you've been calling Little Wren. And I'd like to present my records to this body, because I've been keeping them for 3 years, and I think this room deserves to see what's actually in them." The silence lasted another 2 seconds. Then everyone started talking at once. Judge Price banged the flat of his hand on the table. He didn't have a gavel, which had always struck Hannah as an oversight, and called for order. It took a moment, but the room settled. Robert Bellamy had not moved. He was looking at Hannah with that same controlled absence of expression, but there was something underneath it now, not quite surprise, but a recalculation happening behind his eyes, the look of a chess player who has just watched a piece appear on the board that he hadn't accounted for. "Miss Whitaker," Judge Price said, with the careful tone of a man trying to decide which way to fall. This is somewhat irregular. So is accusing someone publicly without naming them," Hannah said. "I thought I'd make it easier by naming myself." Someone in the room laughed. Short, quickly suppressed sound, but it was there. Price looked at Robert. Robert gave the tiniest of nods, barely perceptible, but Hannah caught it, and she understood what it meant. He was adapting. She had come forward fine. That could work too. Let her present her records. Let the commission review them. Let the process drag out long enough for the rumor to do its work, regardless of what the paper trail showed. What he hadn't accounted for was that Hannah didn't intend to hand the records to a commission. She intended to read them out loud. "If the body will permit," Hannah said to Price, "I'd like to address the specific claims made. It will take some time, but I think everyone here has a right to the full picture." Price hesitated. He looked at Robert again, but Robert's expression had gone carefully neutral, which was not the clear signal Price had been hoping for. In that moment of Price's uncertainty, Cordelia Voss turned in her seat and said, in the carrying voice of a woman who was accustomed to being listened to, "Let her speak, Alderman. It's an assembly. That's what we're here for." It was not what Robert had intended Cordelia to do. Hannah could see that from the brief, almost invisible tension that crossed his face. Price cleared his throat. "Miss Whitaker, you may proceed." Hannah opened her bag. She started from the beginning, not from 3 years ago. From the very first night, the winter of 1879, Bess Connolly, the pillowcase, the room in the back of the poorhouse. She told it plainly, without embellishment, because the plain version was sufficient and she wasn't there to perform. She described what she'd found and what she'd brought and why she'd decided to keep going back. The room listened. She could feel it, the particular quality of a crowd that has stopped acting to itself and started paying attention to something external. Then she opened the record book and began reading entries. She read them in groups, not every single line, because that would have taken longer than the assembly could sustain, but enough to show the pattern, enough to show the dates and the items and the amounts and the sources, and to make clear that every single thing she had taken from the Bellamy household had been documented as discarded waste at the time of collection, and that she had written it down. She read the cost columns. The amount she had spent from her own wages, added up over 3 years, came to a total that made several people in the room do visible arithmetic and come to a conclusion that landed quietly but firmly on their faces. She read the list of supplies she'd bought with her own money, the list of medicine, the list of food. Then she looked up from the record book and said, "The anonymous medical donation that arrived at the poorhouse 4 weeks ago is also in here. I logged it as a donation from an unnamed source, which is accurate. I have no idea who sent it." She held Price's gaze. "The commission wants to investigate that there."
"Welcome to—"
"I expect they won't find anything improper." She paused, then said, "I also want to address Mr. Bellamy's implication about items taken from private households. She could feel Robert's attention sharpen from across the room. Over 3 years, I took certain items from the Bellamy household. All of them were items explicitly set aside for disposal: food scraps, worn fabric, near empty medicine bottles, candle ends. I documented each one at the time of collection, along with the reason it was designated as waste. I have those records here. She held up a separate, smaller sheaf of papers. If Mr. Bellamy wishes to review them and dispute my characterization of those items as waste, I welcome the comparison against his own household records. The implication was clear. If Robert wanted to pursue the theft accusation, he would need to produce his household waste disposal records in a public forum, which would mean admitting that his household routinely discarded enough usable food and medicine to sustain a significant charitable operation, and had been doing so for years while the poorhouse on Crow's Road went underfunded. Robert understood the implication. His jaw moved very slightly. He did not reach for his own papers. Hannah set the smaller sheaf down on top of the record book and looked out at the room. "I did all of this quietly," she said, "because I thought drawing attention to it would cause exactly this kind of problem. I understand now that staying quiet has costs of its own. So I'm done being quiet." The room was still, not the polite stillness of an audience waiting for a performance to continue, something with more weight to it. The kind of stillness that comes when a room full of people is collectively revising something they thought they already knew. Then the back doors of the assembly hall opened. Cole Ryder walked in, and the room noticed, the way it always noticed when Cole walked into any space, not because he made an entrance, but because he was a man that space reorganized itself slightly around. He moved through the rows without hurrying, hat in hand, and came to stand at the front near Hannah's position. He hadn't told her he was going to do this. She had not asked him to. He had simply decided, somewhere in the 48 hours before the assembly, that there were things in this room that needed saying that Hannah couldn't say without looking like she was defending herself, and that he was in a position to say them differently. Mr. Ryder Price said, clearly uncertain whether this was welcome. "Is there something?" "I have some documents for the body," Cole said. He reached into the interior pocket of his coat and produced a folded set of papers. He set them on the table in front of Price. Price looked at them. His expression changed. "What are these?" Robert said. The controlled neutrality had cracked slightly, not into anger, but into something more dangerous for a man like Robert Bellamy, genuine uncertainty about what was happening. Deed of trust and articles of establishment for the Carver County Community Foundation, Cole said, filed with the county clerk's office 4 days ago. The foundation holds legal title to 12 acres of land adjacent to the Crow's Road property in permanent trust for community charitable use, funded privately. It has a board of 3 directors and a charter that prevents any individual from dissolving it for personal gain. He looked at Price. Fully legal. Greer did the paperwork. Thomas Greer, sitting in the 3rd row with his brown coat and his careful expression, raised one hand slightly in acknowledgement. Robert Bellamy looked at the documents. He looked at Cole. Something moved behind his eyes, not defeat, not yet, because Robert Bellamy was not a man who arrived at defeat easily, but the room had shifted under him in a way he hadn't arranged, and he was registering that. "This doesn't address the Commission's concerns about Miss Whitaker's activities," Robert said. His voice was still steady. "Barely." "No," Cole agreed. "Miss Whitaker addressed those herself, pretty thoroughly, I thought." He looked out at the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform. He simply spoke the way he always spoke, directly, without ornamentation, and the room listened because he was Cole Ryder, and they had always listened to Cole Ryder. "What I want to say to this body is simple. I've lived in this county for 20 years. I've attended this assembly every year, and in 20 years, I have watched the poorhouse on Crow's Road operate with a fraction of what it needs every single year, while this commission spends its time on road surveys and water rights disputes. I'm not criticizing. Those things matter. But I want the people in this room to understand what Miss Whitaker has been doing while we've been busy with other things. She has been doing, alone and at her own expense, what a county this size should have had the collective decency to organize properly years ago. Paused. Not for effect. He was choosing his words. They called her powerless, he said, because they never bothered to see what she was capable of. The room was quiet. Cordelia Voss was looking at Cole with an expression that was difficult to read, not admiration exactly, but the careful assessment of a woman who has just taken in new information and is integrating it. Several of the ranchers near the back of the room were looking at each other with the slightly uncomfortable expressions of people who are being asked, implicitly, to account for themselves. Robert Bellamy sat with his hands flat on his thighs and said nothing. The assembly did not resolve cleanly. Hannah had not expected it to. Real things rarely resolved cleanly. What happened was a gradual, somewhat disorganized unraveling of Robert's carefully constructed scenario, not a dramatic defeat, because Robert was too skilled to be dramatically defeated in public, but a series of small structural failures, each one making the next one harder to prevent. Cordelia Voss was the first significant shift. She stood up, without asking Price's permission, and addressed the room in the way. She always addressed rooms, with the calm certainty of someone who has never had occasion to doubt whether they'd be listened to. "I have a question for Mr. Bellamy," she said. "The items Miss Whitaker took from your household, the waste items she documented, were they waste, or were they not?" Robert said they were waste items. Yet, properly speaking, but the issue was the principle of "Then she took waste," Cordelia said, "and she turned it into something useful. And she kept better records than most men I know keep of their own accounts." She sat back down, satisfied. It was not a ringing endorsement. Cordelia was not a woman who gave ringing endorsements. But in Carver County, Cordelia Voss saying she was satisfied carried a particular authority that Robert's newspaper piece and his letters to the judge had been specifically designed to undercut and had now failed to undercut. The rancher named Webb, who had leaned to whisper to his wife earlier, raised his hand and asked whether the county commission planned to formally review the foundation documents and consider codifying the charitable operation into official county business. Price said he supposed the commission could take that under advisement. Dutch Farrow, who had come to the assembly without anyone, particularly noticing Dutch, had a gift for being present without being noticed that Cole had always considered his most valuable quality, caught Cole's eye from across the room and gave him a look that said, "Well, that went better than it could have." Cole didn't respond. He was watching Robert Bellamy. Robert had not moved from his seat. He was watching the room with the particular stillness of a man who is not finished, who is absorbing what has happened, cataloging it, and filing it away for later, not conceding, calculating. That was the thing about men like Robert Bellamy that Hannah had understood from the beginning, and that she was now reminding herself of as she stood at the front of the room, with her record book in her hands, and the relief trying to work its way through her chest without making her lose her composure. This was not over. A public reversal in a county assembly was a setback for a man like Robert, but it was not an end. He had resources and time, and a very long memory, and he was the kind of person who distinguished between a battle and a war. She would need to remember that. The assembly broke up in the disorganized way that assemblies do, not a clear conclusion, but a gradual dispersal, people standing and talking in clusters, the official business, dissolving into the social business that was for most of them the real point of coming. Hannah stood near the front. For a moment, the record book still in her hands, adjusting to the strange sensation of being looked at rather than looked through. Several people she barely knew came to speak to her. A woman from the east end of the county who said her family had received supplies the previous winter, and she'd always wondered who to thank. A young man who identified himself as Ada Marsh's nephew and said Ada sent her regards, and that she'd been saying a prayer he caught himself, amended it that she'd been hoping this would go the right way. Hannah thanked them. She was not graceful about it, spent so many years avoiding exactly this kind of attention that she didn't have a practiced way of receiving it, probably came across as stiff or distracted. She was a little of both. Cole found her when the room had thinned out to about a third of its original crowd. He came to stand beside her rather than in front of her, that small positional choice she registered, without necessarily knowing what to do with it. "You did well," he said. "It isn't over," she said. "No, it isn't." She looked at him, the foundation. "You didn't tell me you were doing that. I wasn't sure how you'd take it." "You were right to be unsure." She held his gaze. "I don't love that you didn't tell me." Cole nodded, accepting that without deflection. "I should have told you. I was afraid you'd say no." "I might have, I know." She was quiet for a moment. "It's a good thing you did. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But decisions like that, about things that are connected to what I've been building, I need to be part of those decisions. Not informed after the fact." "Yes," Cole said. Just the one word. And he meant it. And she could tell he meant it. And that was, she thought, the best possible response he could have given. "All right," she said. "Then we proceed together." She extended her hand. He shook it, and something about the formality of it, the deliberateness of it, was exactly right. This was not a romantic gesture. It was a partnership being declared in the plainest possible terms. Behind them, near the door, Robert Bellamy put on his hat and walked out of the assembly hall without speaking to anyone. What happened in the 3 days after the assembly moved faster than Hannah had anticipated. Families she had helped, the 7 she'd spoken to beforehand, and several more who came forward on their own, after hearing what had happened at the assembly, began to talk, not in any organized way. It was more like water finding its level. The information spread through the county through conversation, through the networks of people who saw each other at feed stores and watering troughs, and along shared fence lines, and it spread with the particular authority of first-hand testimony. A woman named June Hartley told anyone who would listen that Hannah Whitaker had appeared at her door on a February night 3 years ago with medicine for her youngest son, who had a fever that was worsening by the hour, and that her son was alive today because of it. She did not exaggerate. She didn't need to. The young man from the assembly, Peter, Ada Marsh's nephew, who turned out to be 18 and considerably more capable than Hannah had ever given him credit for, organized a gathering at the poorhouse itself, which Ada agreed to host, where people who wanted to learn about the foundation could come and hear from Ada directly about how the operation worked and what it needed. Cole sent Dutch Farrow to attend. Dutch reported back that approximately 40 people had shown up, which was about 38 more than Ada had expected. Hannah heard all of this second and third hand because she was still, technically, employed in the Bellamy household. She still woke up in her small room off the kitchen. She still taught Frederick and Iris their lessons in the morning. She still ate her meals at the far end of the table. But something had changed in the quality of the silence around her in that house. Mrs. Pratt no longer watched her with that careful, score-keeping attention. She watched her with something closer to avoidance, which was different. Robert Bellamy did not speak to her directly at all in the days after the assembly they passed in the corridor once, and he looked through her with the deliberate, precise non-acknowledgement of a man who has filed her in a different category and will deal with her in his own time. Clara Bellamy, Robert's wife, did something unexpected on the 3rd day. Came to the schoolroom in the mid-morning, while the children were working on their letters, and stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. Hannah looked up. Clara Bellamy was a woman who had the permanent expression of someone standing very still in a wind she couldn't name. She'd been pleasant to Hannah in a detached way for 4 years, not unkind, not warm. Somewhere in the careful middle ground of a woman who understood her household's hierarchy and maintained it without cruelty. She said, "I heard what you said at the assembly." Hannah said, "Yes, ma'am." Clara looked at her for a moment. "I've been here 14 years, she said. "I know which shelves Robert checks and which ones he doesn't." Hannah said nothing. Clara said, "I hope things go the right way for you, Miss Whitaker." And she turned and walked back down the hall. Hannah looked at Frederick and Iris, who were both watching her with the open curiosity of children who sense that something has happened without understanding what. "Back to your letters," Hannah said. Her voice was steady. Frederick went back to his letters. Hannah looked out the window at the flat October sky and let herself feel, for just a moment, the strange, complicated weight of what Clara Bellamy had just told her. Not about Robert's checking habits, about 14 years, about what a person absorbed and endured and quietly filed away when they lived inside someone else's arrangement for long enough. She turned back to the lesson. Robert Bellamy made his second move on the 5th day, and it was sharper than the first. He had his lawyer deliver a formal written notice to Hannah that her position in the Bellamy household was terminated, effective in 7 days. The notice cited a general restructuring of household staff. It offered no further explanation and no severance. Hannah read the notice once, folded it, and put it in her bag. She had expected this. She had not expected it to arrive quite this quickly, which meant Robert was more rattled by the assembly than he'd shown. A man operating from a position of pure confidence would have waited longer. He would have made her wait for the end to come so that the waiting itself would be a pressure. The speed of this told her something useful about where he actually was. She wrote 2 letters that evening, one to Thomas Greer, asking whether there were any legal grounds to contest the dismissal and what the likely outcome would be. The second to Cole. The second letter was harder to write than the first, not because she didn't know what to say, because she was aware, in a way she hadn't been a month ago, that asking Cole Ryder for help now meant something different than it had when they were 2 private people operating in parallel. The assembly had made them visible together. Whatever she asked him for now would be understood by the county and understood by her in the context of that visibility. She wrote it anyway. She needed to know whether the foundation arrangements included any provision for housing, the people connected to its operation, or whether she needed to begin looking for a room in town immediately. She sealed both letters and asked Peter, who had apparently made himself a semi-permanent fixture at the edge of the Bellamy property in recent days, to deliver them. Cole's response came back the following morning, brought by Dutch Pharaoh, who handed it to her at the kitchen garden gate without any comment beyond a short nod. Cole had written 4 sentences. The foundation holds a small residence on the adjacent property, been used as caretakers' quarters. It's yours if you want it. Come look at it before you decide. Hannah read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket and spent the rest of the morning teaching Frederick the difference between a noun and a verb with considerably more patience than the task usually required from her, because she needed something steady under her hands while her mind worked through what came next. 7 days. She had 7 days left in this house. And beyond those 7 days, for the first time in 4 years, she had something that looked cautiously, imperfectly, in the provisional way that real things looked like a choice. She wasn't certain yet what she was going to do with it, but she was going to look at the caretaker's quarters, going to talk to Greer. She was going to finish what she'd started at that assembly. And Robert Bellamy, she understood now, with a clarity that the last few days had sharpened considerably, had made a fundamental miscalculation when he'd stood up in that room and begun to speak. He had assumed that exposing Hannah Whitaker would diminish her. He had not considered the possibility that the county would look at what she'd been doing for 3 years and decide, quietly and collectively, that it liked what it saw. He had not considered that visibility, for the right person at the right moment was not a wound. It was an opening. Hannah closed the grammar primer, told the children they were done for the day, and went inside to begin packing the few things that were hers. Caretaker's quarters were worse than Cole had implied. Hannah stood in the doorway on a gray November morning, bag over one shoulder, and looked at what she'd been offered. The room was small, one main space, a sleeping alcove, a fireplace that had clearly not been used in at least 2 seasons, judging by the state of the flue, and a window on the south wall, with a crack running diagonally through the lower pane that someone had attempted to seal with a strip of oilcloth. The floor was wood, which was something. The ceiling had a water stain, in one corner the shape of a misshapen hand. There was a cot, a table, 2 chairs, and a shelf that leaned about 4 degrees to the left. Cole stood behind her. She could feel him waiting for her reaction. "It leans," she said, meaning the shelf. "I know, I was going to fix it." "When?" "I didn't know anyone was going to be living here." Hannah set her bag on the table and walked to the fireplace. She crouched and looked up the flue, then reached in and knocked the damper lever until it moved. A small rain of black debris came down. She stood up, brushed her hands on her skirt, and looked at the room with the systematic attention of someone taking genuine inventory. Cold. The oilcloth on the window was letting in a thin whistle of outside air. The stain on the ceiling suggested the roof above had at some point let water through, though the wood didn't feel soft underfoot, so it had dried. The fireplace was functional if the chimney was clear. Cot had a thin mattress that would need a proper blanket before the temperature dropped further. It was considerably worse than her room at the Bellamy house. It was also entirely hers. "I'll take it," she said. Cole let out a breath. She wasn't sure whether it was relief or something else. "I'll have someone come for the flue tomorrow morning," he said, "and I'll fix the shelf today. The window needs proper glass. I'll get glass from town, and I'll need a lamp. The one I had at the Bellamy's was theirs." "Done." She turned and looked at him. He was standing in the doorway, hat in his hands, wearing the expression he wore when he was waiting to find out what came next, not anxious, not eager, just present in the patient way that she was gradually learning was simply how Cole Ryder operated. He didn't fill silences with noise. She'd noticed that the first night on the road, and she'd kept noticing it since. "Pay rent," she said. "Hannah, I'm not living in a foundation property for free, Cole. I'll be doing work for the foundation. Someone needs to manage the operations and the records and the community interface. That's real work, and I'll do it. But the housing needs to be a separate line, or it muddies everything. What the foundation does and what I do personally need to be clearly distinct." He considered this. $5 a month. He frowned. "That's more than it's worth. That's what a room and board arrangement runs in this county, and you know it." She held his gaze. $10. "And it goes into the foundation's account, not your pocket." A long pause. "Fine," he said. "Fine," she said. She turned back to the shelf and tested its weight. It would need a proper brace. She could probably manage that herself, if she had the right tools, which she didn't, not yet. Outside, the November wind moved through the pine trees on the property line. It was the beginning of something, and the beginning was imperfect and cold, and came with a leaning shelf and an oilcloth window. And Hannah, who had never been given anything clean and finished in her life, found she trusted imperfect beginnings more than perfect ones. Thomas Greer's letter arrived 2 days after she moved in. She read it sitting at the table with a cup of coffee that was too weak because she'd rationed the grounds. The lamp Cole had brought casting a yellow circle on the page. Greer's assessment of the wrongful dismissal question was thorough, which was his way, and arrived at a conclusion that was simultaneously accurate and frustrating. Technically, Robert Bellamy had operated within his legal rights as an employer. Hannah had been engaged without a formal contract, which was standard for household service positions in the county, and could be released at will. The 7 days' notice was minimal but not illegal. However, Greer wrote, in a second paragraph that Hannah read 3 times, there was a separate matter worth pursuing. Robert Bellamy had, in his public statements at the county assembly, implied that Hannah had misappropriated household property. He had not made this accusation explicitly. He was too careful for that, but the implication was present and documented in the assembly minutes. If Robert took any further action based on that implication, or if the accusation was repeated publicly in more direct terms, there were grounds for a defamation claim that Greer would be willing to argue. Hannah set the letter down and thought about that. It was, in its way, a kind of shield. Not the kind you could wave in the air and have people see. Quieter kind, the kind that sat in a lawyer's office, and made a man with long experience in these matters think twice before his next move. She wrote back to Greer, asking what it would cost to have him on retainer. His response came the following week, and named a figure that was more than she could manage monthly, but less than she'd feared. She told him she'd pay him in installments, the same way she'd paid the pharmacist in town for 3 years. He agreed. In the same week, she sat down with Ada Marsh and began properly organizing what the foundation was and what it needed to do. Ada was not an easy person to work with. She had been running the poorhouse for 6 years on her own judgment and her own systems, such as they were, and she had the particular territorial wariness of someone who has survived by being the person who knew where everything was and how everything worked, and who understood that knowledge as a form of self-protection. She wasn't hostile to Hannah, but she wasn't simply deferential either. And Hannah didn't want deference. She wanted someone who actually knew the operations from the inside, and Ada knew them better than anyone. Their first proper meeting took place at the poorhouse kitchen table on a cold Wednesday morning. Ada had a list. Hannah had her record book. They spread both out on the table and spent 3 hours going through them together, which involved 2 significant disagreements. One about the system for tracking incoming supplies, and one about the criteria for admitting new residents, and one moment where Ada said something blunt enough that Hannah had to stop herself from responding too quickly, and instead took a breath and asked Ada to explain further. Ada explained further. Hannah reconsidered her position. They reached a compromise that was, on reflection, better than what either of them had proposed individually. By the end of the 3 hours, neither of them was entirely comfortable, but some things had settled between them, the particular settling that happens when 2 capable people who don't entirely trust each other yet have nevertheless managed to accomplish something real. Same time next week? Ada said yes. Hannah says. Ada nodded, gathered her list, and went back to the kitchen without ceremony. Hannah walked home in the cold with her record book under her arm, feeling tired in a way that was more satisfying than she had words for. Cole saw Hannah 4 or 5 times a week through the month of November, which was more than he'd anticipated, and which he'd stopped pretending to himself was entirely attributable to foundation business. Some of it genuinely was. There were decisions to make about the adjacent property, the 12 acres needed, a clear plan for how they'd be used, which required conversations with Ada about what the poorhouse population actually needed versus what it currently had, required Cole to understand the operational picture well enough to have an informed view, which meant he was spending time at the foundation property, talking with both women about things he'd never previously had occasion to think about in much detail. He learned things. That was the part he hadn't expected. Not just practical about how a charitable operation functioned, though there was plenty of that, but things about the county he'd lived in for 20 years that had apparently been happening, and the part of it he'd never looked at directly. Families cycling through the poorhouse. The way a bad drought compounded across 3 seasons didn't just hurt the big ranches, it destroyed the small ones entirely. And then the families who'd worked the small ones had nowhere to go. The particular cruelty of the fact that the people with the least means were also the people with the least access to the medicine and legal advice and community resources that might have made their situation recoverable. He'd known this in a general way. He hadn't known it the way you know something when you're sitting at Ada Marsh's kitchen table looking at 6 years of poorly funded intake records. He thought about Margaret. He did that less than he used to, and when he did now, it was different, less like pressing on a bruise, more like referencing something he'd integrated. Margaret would have liked Ada Marsh, he thought. Margaret would have liked Hannah too, though she would have spent the first week trying to get Hannah to relax, with limited success. Kept that thought to himself. What he didn't keep to himself, because he'd made a commitment at the assembly about not being the person who looked away anymore, and he intended to honor that in the small ways, as well as the large ones, was the question of what was happening with Robert Bellamy. He raised it with Hannah on a Thursday afternoon in late November, standing in the Foundation's main room, which had been a storage space and was in the process of being converted into a workable common area with the help of two of Cole's hands who'd volunteered their time. "He's quiet," Cole said. Hannah didn't look up from the supply manifest she was revising. "He's been quiet before. This is different quiet." He pulled the advertising from Aldridge's paper. She looked up then. "Dutch heard it from the typesetter," Cole said. "Aldridge is in a difficult spot financially without that account, and Robert isn't replacing it with anything, he's just pulling it." No explanation. Hannah set down her pen. "He's cutting support from anyone who didn't perform the way he expected. That's what it looks like. Which means he's pulling back and reassessing. Not giving up. No," Cole said. "Not giving up." She was quiet for a moment, working through whatever she was working through. Cole had learned over these weeks not to fill the space when she did that. She wasn't stalling or avoiding. She was thinking, and she thought better without noise in the way. "He still has the boundary survey dispute with you," she said finally. "Yes." "Can he use that to pressure you? Slow the Foundation work? Tie up the land in dispute?" Cole had thought about this. "He can try. Greer says the survey records are clear on our side. The disputed line runs 200 feet east of the Foundation property. It doesn't touch the deed of trust. But Robert could commission a counter-survey and delay the final ruling for months." Hannah picked her pen back up. "Then we build as much as we can before that happens. The community is already using the space. A land dispute that looks like it's trying to shut down a functioning charitable operation plays differently than a survey dispute about a vacant field." Cole looked at her. "That's not a bad instinct." "It's not an instinct. It's the same thing he was doing building structure before anyone could pull it apart. He just had more resources to work with." She made a correction on the manifest. "We'll have to be faster." He nodded. Outside, the sound of his two hands working on the common room wall. Steady hammer strikes. Unhurried marked the afternoon in regular intervals. "Hannah," he said. She looked up again. He'd been trying to say something for about 2 weeks, and he kept arriving at the edge of it and stopping himself, which was not a habit he'd been aware of having before. He was aware of it now because it was irritating him. "I want to say something, and I want you to tell me honestly how it lands," he said. "All right, I'm not doing this because I feel guilty about some past failure. I know that could look like what's happening. Man with money and land decides to get involved in charitable work because he's trying to balance an account somewhere. That's not what this is for me." Hannah was watching him with the attentive, direct gaze that had unsettled him from the first night on the road. "I know that," she said. "I wanted to make sure. I know it because you don't behave like someone who's managing guilt. You behave like someone who's paying attention to something he hadn't been paying attention to before. There's a difference." She paused. "I've met men who do charitable things out of guilt. They need to be thanked. They need to be visible. They need the people they're helping to be grateful in a particular way." She tilted her head slightly. "You haven't asked me for any of that." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Margaret," he said. It was the first time he'd said his sister's name to Hannah. She waited. "She died because nobody stepped in. I told myself afterward that I'd never be the person who looked away, and for a while I meant it, but I kept it small individual things, quiet things, because making it bigger felt like it would mean something more than I was prepared for it to mean." Hannah didn't say anything immediately. The hammer strikes continued outside. A board went down somewhere in the adjacent room with a solid thud. "I understand that," she said finally. "I kept it small too. Different reasons. Same result." "What were your reasons?" A pause. "If nobody knew what I was doing, nobody could tell me to stop." He hadn't thought of it that way. The self-protection and invisibility wasn't just about avoiding attention. It was about keeping the thing itself safe, the operation, the deliveries, the little brown record book. If she made it big, it became something that could be taken from her, which in the end, Robert Bellamy had tried to do anyway. "For what it's worth," Cole said, "I don't think he can take it now." "No," Hannah agreed. "Not without the county watching." She went back to the manifest. He stayed where he was for another moment and then went to see how the common room was coming along. December arrived cold and fast, the way it always did on the Virginia frontier, not gradually, but like a door slamming shut. The ground hardened overnight. The creek on the east side of the foundation property froze in the shallow sections. Hannah's window, now properly glazed thanks to Cole's trip to town, held against the wind, which was the most she'd asked of it. She had been in the caretaker's quarters for 5 weeks. The shelf had been properly braced. The flue had been cleaned. She'd acquired, by various means, a second blanket, a better lamp, a small hooked rug for the floor that one of the poorhouse women had made and insisted on giving her as a housewarming gift, an old frontier custom that Hannah had not been aware of and had found unexpectedly moving. She'd thanked the woman 3 times, which the woman found excessive and said so, and which Hannah found she didn't mind being told. Common room at the foundation was functional by the first week of December. It wasn't finished. It probably wouldn't be finished for months, because finishing things properly took materials and time, and both were in limited supply, but it was usable. Ada had organized a rotation of the poorhouse residents who were physically able to help with maintenance and upkeep, which gave people work and purpose and reduced the pressure on the small paid staff. 11 new families had come to Ada in the weeks since the county assembly, having heard through the community grapevine that the foundation existed and that it might be able to help them. 3 of those families had been quietly redirected from speaking to the county commission, which had offered them nothing, to speaking with Ada, who had offered them something concrete. Cole had not been invisible in this. His name was attached to the foundation's establishment, and the county knew it. And that association had a practical effect. Landowners who might have been skeptical of Hannah's operation on its own were more willing to donate supplies and time and quiet financial support when they understood that Cole Ryder had put his name and his land behind it. Hannah had mixed feelings about this, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge both halves of it. She didn't love that his credibility was doing work that her 3 years of documented service hadn't done on its own. She understood why it was happening. The county ran on certain hierarchies. Those hierarchies were not going to dissolve because of good speech at an assembly. Working inside them was not the same as endorsing them. She told Cole this one evening, not as a complaint but as a plain statement of fact, because she'd found that plain statements of fact were the most productive way to communicate with him. He sat with it for a moment. "I know," he said. "It's not fair. I'm not asking for fair. I'm noting the reality so that we're both clear-eyed about what's actually propelling this. Does it change what you want to do with it? No. Then I suppose we use what we have and keep building until the structure can stand without the history behind my name." It was the right answer. She was aware that he was getting better at right answers, and she was aware that she was letting herself notice that which was its own kind of information. Robert Bellamy's 3rd move came on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of December, and unlike the first 2, it didn't come through public channels. It came through Gideon. Gideon was Robert's man had been for 12 years, handled everything from correspondence to the less visible kinds of errands that a man of Robert's position occasionally required. Hannah had known Gideon by sight from her years at the Bellamy house, the way you knew all the fixtures of a household without particularly registering them as individuals. She was surprised, therefore, to find Gideon standing at the foundation property gate on a cold Tuesday morning, alone, without his usual composed air of professional indifference. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was not entirely certain it was the right one. "Miss Whitaker?" he said. "Gideon." She waited. He handed her an envelope, plain unsealed. She opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper. On it, in Robert Bellamy's careful hand, was written an offer. Hannah would receive $150 and a written letter of reference in exchange for her permanent withdrawal from the foundation's operations, and her formal agreement to leave Carver County within 30 days. Hannah read it once. She folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. She looked at Gideon. "He sent you to deliver this personally?" "Yes, ma'am." Does he expect an answer today? He expects an answer by the end of the week. She looked at Gideon for a moment. He was a man somewhere in his 40s, and he had the face of someone who had spent a long time being the mechanism through which other people's decisions were executed, and who had learned to separate himself from the content of those decisions as a matter of professional survival. But there was something in the way he was holding himself, not quite discomfort, but an awareness that she registered. Gideon, she said, you've worked for him 12 years. Yes, ma'am. Do you think this is going to work? Pause. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Think, he said carefully, that Mr. Bellamy is accustomed to people taking what's offered when the alternative is uncertain. The alternative doesn't feel that uncertain to me, Hannah said. Gideon nodded once, in a way that suggested he had expected this response, and perhaps had not been entirely opposed to it. I'll tell him you need until Friday, he said. Tell him I'll have an answer for him Friday. She handed the envelope back. Take this with you. I don't want it in my house. Gideon took the envelope, put it in his coat pocket, and walked back toward the road. Hannah stood at the gate for a moment after he left. $150 was more than 2 years of her wages at the Bellamy house. She was not so far removed from poverty that she could feel entirely indifferent to that number. Felt it. She let herself feel it honestly, the way she'd always let herself feel the real weight of things, because pretending they didn't weigh anything had never once made her stronger. Then she went inside and wrote a letter to Cole. Came that evening. She'd told him about the offer in the letter factually, briefly, and asked if he had time to discuss it. He arrived before supper. She made coffee. They sat at the table. She told him the full exchange, including what Gideon had said. Cole listened. When she finished, he said, "What do you want to do?" She'd expected him to have a position. She was prepared for that, prepared to hear it and weigh it and make her own decision, regardless. What she hadn't quite expected was for his first question to be what she wanted. Decline, she said. Then decline. It's not that simple. If I decline and he escalates, if the counter survey comes in, or he finds some other lever, there's real risk. To the foundation. To people depending on what Ada is doing over there. Yes. You understand that? I do, and you still think declining is the right call. Cole put his coffee cup down. I think accepting would end it for him, but not for you. You'd know you left. And whatever he tries next, we can fight. We've already shown we can fight. Hannah looked at her own cup. He could go after the deed of trust. Tie it up long enough that the foundation can't operate effectively. Greer thinks the survey line is clean. Greer has been wrong before. He has, it's a risk. Cole was quiet for a moment. Nothing about this is certain, Hannah. You know that better than I do. You've been living inside uncertainty for 3 years. I'm not going to tell you the risk isn't real. She appreciated that. More than a reassurance would have satisfied her. I'm going to decline, she said, and I need you to know that when I do, whatever comes next is going to land on both of us, not just me. I know, and you're prepared for that. He looked at her with the direct, undecorated steadiness that she'd come to understand was simply him. I've been prepared since the night I watched you feed a child in the dark and figured out that what you were doing was more important than anything I'd been doing. She didn't know what to do with that exactly. It was too honest for deflection and too significant for a simple acknowledgement. She sat with it for a moment. Margaret would have done what you've been doing, Cole said. It's not why I'm here. But I want you to know that I thought of her when I understood what you were, what little Wren was. I think she would have known immediately who you were and liked you for it. Hannah was quiet. What was she like? Stubborn. Couldn't be still. Laugh that was too loud for polite company. A brief pause. She would have fixed that shelf before I got the chance. Hannah almost smiled. Then I'm sorry I didn't get to meet her. So am I. The lamp between them held its ground against the winter dark outside. Neither of them said anything for a while, and neither of them felt the need to. She sent her response to Robert Bellamy on Friday morning through Peter, which she knew would irritate Robert, being answered through a 12-year-old boy rather than through any channel he'd established or expected. She did it deliberately. The response was 3 sentences. She thanked him for his offer. She declined. She wished him well with his survey dispute. Cole, when she told him what she'd written, looked at her for a moment and said, the survey dispute line was probably unnecessary. Probably, she agreed. He didn't tell her to take it back. Robert Bellamy's response was silence, which was its own kind of answer. The silence lasted through the rest of December and into the first weeks of the new year, and it wasn't the comfortable silence of a resolved situation. It was the silence of something being prepared. But December also brought other things that had nothing to do with Robert Bellamy, and Hannah had learned imperfectly, with effort, but genuinely to pay attention to those things when they arrived. Family of 4 came to the foundation property 2 days before Christmas. Father had worked a small farm east of town that had failed entirely in the drought, and he'd lost the lease in the fall. His wife was recovering from a chest infection. Their 2 children, boys aged 8 and 11, stood behind their parents with the particular stillness of children who had learned not to take up too much space. Ada received them. Hannah was in the common room, going over the supply accounts, and she watched through the open door as Ada walked the family through what the foundation could offer temporary housing in the annex that Cole's hands had finished 3 weeks prior. Meals from the communal kitchen, contact with a doctor in town who'd agreed to offer his services at reduced rates. The father, a man named Earl, weathered and tight-jawed and visibly uncomfortable with the act of asking through Ada's explanation, with the expression of someone waiting for the part where they were told what they owed in return. Ada told him the only thing they asked of anyone staying at the foundation was to contribute what they were able. When they were able, that might be labor, skills, or nothing at all if nothing was available, and that none of that was a condition of their welcome. Earl looked at Ada for a long moment. His jaw worked. "We don't take charity," he said. His voice came out rougher than he'd probably intended. Ada said, steady and without softness, "You're not taking charity, Mr. Earl. You're using a community resource that your neighbors built for exactly this purpose. Your neighbors needed it once. You need it now. That's how it works." Earl was quiet. His wife put her hand on his arm. "All right," he said finally. "Cost him something." Hannah could see that it cost him something, and she did not look away from it, because a man's pride being set down in the service of his family's survival was not a small thing and deserved to be witnessed honestly. Hannah went back to her accounts. The 8-year-old boy had found a wooden top somewhere in the common room, left by a previous child, and was spinning it on the floor with focused intensity, as though the whole situation could be simplified down to the problem of keeping the top balanced, which, in the way of 8-year-olds, was perhaps not entirely wrong. Hannah watched him for a moment. Then she turned the page in the ledger and kept working. The new year brought 2 things simultaneously, in the way that consequential things often arrived without regard for convenient timing. The first was a letter from the county commission, signed by Judge Price, informing the Carver County Community Foundation that the commission had voted narrowly, and Hannah suspected with some arm-twisting that she could partly attribute to Cordelia Voss, who had apparently attended 2 commission meetings in December and been heard to formally recognize the foundation as an official county charitable organization. The recognition came with no money. It came with legal standing. Legal standing meant that certain county ordinances around land use and organizational structure that had previously left the foundation in a gray area now didn't apply in the same constraining way. Greer read the commission letter and wrote back to Hannah in the tersest note he'd ever sent her, which said simply, "This helps significantly with the survey dispute." The second thing was Dutch Pharaoh appearing at the foundation gate on a cold January morning with the look of a man delivering information he'd been sitting on long enough that it had become uncomfortable. Cole wasn't with him. "Cole doesn't know I'm here," Dutch said, which was the first thing he said before Hannah had even fully opened the gate. She looked at him. "All right, Robert Bellamy has been talking to 2 of Cole's major cattle buyers. Men who've done business with the ranch for 8 and 12 years, respectively. Dutch was not a person who used extra words, which Hannah appreciated. He's been suggesting that Cole's recent activities represent a significant change in his business priorities, that he's become more interested in social projects than in running a serious operation, that he may not be the reliable long-term partner he's been. Hannah felt the cold of the morning more sharply. He's going after Cole's business. He's going after Cole's reputation with people who might believe it because they've watched Cole spend half time here lately instead of at the ranch. Does Cole know? I don't know. I found out last night from a hand who heard it from one of the buyer's people. Dutch looked at her steadily. I came here first because I thought you should know before Cole does, since it's partly about you. And because I thought you'd want the chance to think before you talk to him. Hannah stood at the gate in the cold morning and processed this. Dutch was right that she wanted the chance to think. She also felt something sharp and unpleasant moving through her, not guilt, exactly, because she hadn't created Robert Bellamy's nature, but the particular weight of consequences landing on someone who had chosen to stand beside her and was now paying a price she hadn't asked him to pay. How serious is it? She asked. The buyers? If both of them pull their contracts, the ranch loses about 30% of its cattle revenue for the year. 30% was real. Cole's operation was large, and he could absorb a loss better than most, but 30% was not abstract. Thank you, Dutch, she said. For coming. Dutch nodded. I'll tell you one more thing, and then I'll go. Go ahead. I've worked for Cole Ryder for 12 years. In 12 years, I've never once seen him make a decision that he later walked back because the cost turned out to be higher than he thought. Not once. Dutch held her gaze. Whatever you're thinking about telling him whatever offer you're considering making, so he can step back from this with a clean reason, don't. He doesn't want it and he won't take it, and it'll put you two back by about a month. Hannah looked at him for a long moment. You know him well. Well enough. Dutch touched the brim of his hat. Good morning, Miss Whitaker. He rode back up the road. Hannah stood at the gate a while longer. The cold was thorough and complete. The pine trees at the property line moved slightly in a wind she couldn't feel from where she stood. Dutch was right. She knew it without needing to deliberate. She was not going to make Cole a polite exit. She was not going to manage him. She was going to tell him what she knew and let him decide, because that was the only arrangement between two people that was worth anything. She went inside and wrote him a letter. He arrived that afternoon, read Dutch's information in the same flat silence he applied to most incoming difficulties, and said 30%. That's what Dutch estimated. Cole was quiet for a moment, standing at the window, the properly glazed window, looking out at the foundation property. A group of the annex residents were working in the yard, stacking lumber for a repair to the storage building. Earl's 11-year-old was among them, handing boards to an adult who was directing the work with the focused authority of someone who knew what he was doing. I knew he'd move eventually, Cole said. I know you did. The buyers are both fair weather. They go where the contracts are comfortable. He turned from the window. I can replace them. It'll take time and it'll cost more for a season, but I can replace them. Are you certain? No. But I'm not walking back from this because Robert Bellamy decided to make it expensive. He said it the same way he said most things without drama, without the particular performance of resolve that resolved nothing, just the statement. Hannah looked at him. What do you need from me? He seemed briefly surprised by the question. Nothing. You're not responsible for Cole. She kept her voice level. We're doing this together. That means when something hits you, I ask what you need. What do you need? He thought about it seriously, which she'd known he would. He didn't dismiss the question because it had been offered without the particular gendered hierarchy that would have made it easy to dismiss. Time, he said finally. I need to ride out to both buyers in the next week and make my case in person. I need the ranch to look like what it is, a serious functioning operation, which means I need to spend some time over there that I haven't been spending. Then do that. The foundation, I can manage the foundation. That's literally my job. Go manage yours, a pause. Something shifted in his expression, not relief, but something adjacent to it, like a man being given permission he'd needed but hadn't known how to ask for. I'll be back for the commission meeting on the 17th, he said. I'll have the agenda ready. He picked up his hat from the table where he'd set it. He stood there for a moment, hat in hand, in the way she'd come to recognize as Cole about to say something he'd been working up to. Hannah. She waited. I want to say something, and I mean it plainly, so don't read more into it than I put there. All right. I'm glad I rode out on that road 2 months ago. She held his gaze, so am I. He put his hat on and walked out, door closed. Outside, the lumber stacking continued, board by board, the 11-year-old handing pieces up with the growing confidence of someone learning that they were capable of useful work. The storage building was going to need a good roof before spring. Hannah added it to the list she carried in her head, the list that had been growing since the day she'd moved in. All the things that needed doing in the specific, non-abstract way that things on this property actually needed doing. She sat back down at the table, picked up her pen, turned to the next page in the ledger. Robert Bellamy was still out there with his long memory and his patient approach, and his willingness to make things difficult for as long as it took. She knew that. She hadn't forgotten it for a single day, but she was still here. Cole was still here. Ada was still here. The 11-year-old was still here, handing up boards in the cold, learning what capable felt like from the outside in. And Hannah Whitaker, who had spent 4 years making herself invisible, so that what she was building couldn't be taken from her, was done being invisible. Whatever came next, it was going to have to come at her directly. She wrote the date at the top of the new page and kept working. Robert Bellamy's counter-survey arrived in the second week of January, delivered by a land assessor from the next county, over a man named Silas Crane, who had the slightly uncomfortable demeanor of someone who knew the work he'd been hired to do was designed to reach a predetermined conclusion. Greer received the survey report the same day Cole did, and Greer's response came by letter the following morning. Counter-survey had redrawn the disputed boundary line in a way that placed approximately 4 acres of the foundation's adjacent property inside the contested zone. Not the main building, not the annex, but the lumber storage, the well on the east side, and the cleared field that Hannah and Ada had been planning to use for a kitchen garden come spring. Cole read Greer's letter at the ranch and then rode to the foundation property without sending word first. He found Hannah in the common room with Ada and Peter, reviewing a supply intake from the previous week. He handed her the letter. She read it. Ada watched her face while she read it, and Ada's expression, which generally operated in a narrow register between composed and unreadable, tightened slightly. Peter, who was 17 and had developed, over the months of working at the foundation, the useful skill of knowing when to be quiet and when to ask questions, was quiet. Well, Hannah said. Yes, Cole said. If the well goes into the disputed zone, we lose access to it during the legal process. Potentially. Greer's filing for an emergency injunction to maintain current use during the dispute. He thinks he can get it, but it'll take 2 weeks, and the outcome isn't certain. Hannah set the letter on the table. She looked at it for a moment, the way she looked at things when she was working through them, not blankly, but with a focused, inward attention that was almost physical in its quality. He's not trying to win the survey, she said. He knows the survey line won't hold. Greer's right about the original records. He's trying to create enough disruption during the process that we lose momentum. New families coming in, the commission recognition still fresh. If we look unstable, for the next 6 weeks, it affects how people see us. Cole sat down across from her. That's what I think too. Then we don't look unstable, Ada said. Both of them looked at her. Ada had her arms folded and the expression of a woman who has been managing crises on inadequate resources for 6 years and is not particularly intimidated by a new one. We keep operating. We make sure anyone coming through that gate sees the same thing they would have seen. We don't talk about the survey publicly unless we're asked, and if we're asked, we say it's being handled through proper legal channels, which is true. The well, Hannah said again. If we lose access, There's a spring on the north edge of the property, Ada said. Not ideal, but I've used it before when the well pump failed. Clean. We'd need to run a barrel system temporarily. Inconvenient. Not fatal. Hannah nodded slowly. She was running through contingencies in that systematic way she had, checking her internal inventory of what was solid and what wasn't. Cole watched her do it and felt something he'd become increasingly familiar with over the past 2 months, a kind of settled certainty that was not the same as confidence, because confidence could be wrong. This was more like orientation. He knew which direction he was facing. All right, Hannah said. We operate. Greer files the injunction. Cole, can you be available if Greer needs supporting documentation from you about the original survey? I'll ride to his office tomorrow. Good. She picked up the letter, folded it, put it in the record book. Filed. Done for now. Peter, go find Earl and tell him we may need to set up the barrel system from the North Spring. Don't tell him why yet. Just ask him to look at it and tell you what he'd need. Peter was already moving toward the door. Yes, ma'am. The three of them sat for a moment in the common room. Outside, someone was splitting wood on the far side of the annex. The regular rhythmic sound of it carried clearly in the cold air. He's going to keep trying, Ada said. It wasn't a question. For a while, Hannah said, until it costs more than it's worth. Ada made a short, considering sound. How do we make it cost more? We outlast him, Hannah said. That's all. We just keep being here. Greer got the injunction. It took 11 days, not 2 weeks, which Greer said was faster than he'd expected, and which he attributed, in his dry and precise way, to the fact that Judge Price had apparently received some communication from Cordelia Voss, suggesting that denying an emergency injunction protecting a county-recognized charitable organization's water access would be an interesting decision to explain at the next social gathering Price attended, at which Cordelia was the primary hostess. Cordelia Voss had not discussed this tactic with Hannah beforehand. When Hannah found out about it through the particular county information network that moved through Peter's family connections and Ada's long-standing relationships with half the county's permanent population, she had a mixed reaction that she spent about a day sitting with before arriving at a conclusion. The conclusion was that she didn't have to admire every tool in the toolbox. She just had to acknowledge that the toolbox existed, and that people used it, and that Cordelia using her social position to protect the foundation was not meaningfully different from Cole using his name to give the foundation credibility. None of these things were pure. The frontier was not a place where purity was a practical option. She wrote Cordelia a letter, a genuine one, not formal, not performed, but honest. She thanked her specifically, acknowledged that she knew what it had cost in social currency, and said that she intended to be worth that investment. Cordelia wrote back 3 days later. Her letter was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph said she'd done what she'd done because it was the right thing, and not because she expected a return, and that Hannah shouldn't mistake tactical self-interest in other areas of her life for her universal operating principle. The second paragraph said that if the foundation ever needed a board member with experience in county governance and absolutely no patience for nonsense, Cordelia was available on Tuesday afternoons. Hannah read that second paragraph twice. Then she put the letter in the record book, alongside the survey report and the commission notification, and the folded note from Gideon with the offer she'd refused. She was building an archive, she realized, not just a ledger. A record of how something got made what it cost, who helped, what tried to stop it, how it survived anyway. Not because she planned to publish it or show it to anyone, just because she thought there was value in things being accurately remembered. Cole made his case to both cattle buyers in person. He rode out to the first one on a gray January morning and spent 2 hours at the man's table drinking bad coffee and talking about cattle prices and drought recovery and the practical economics of running a serious operation in Carver County. He did not mention Robert Bellamy. He did not mention Hannah. He talked about his ranch with the specific, detailed knowledge of a man who had built every part of it himself and knew exactly what each part was worth. The buyer, a cautious man named Forsyth, listened. At the end of 2 hours, he said that he'd heard some things that had given him pause, and that he appreciated Cole riding out to talk plain. Cole said the things he'd heard were the product of a specific business dispute that had nothing to do with the quality or reliability of Ryder Ranch cattle, and that he could provide Forsyth with his last 4 years of delivery records, if that would help. Forsyth said that wouldn't be necessary. He signed the contract renewal 2 days later. The second buyer was harder. His name was Addison, and he was the kind of man who made decisions based on social consensus rather than individual judgment. Not a coward, just a person who found safety in what the room around him seemed to think. Robert Bellamy had worked on Addison more carefully than on Forsyth, and the work had gone deeper. Cole spent 3 hours with Addison and came away uncertain. He told Hannah about it that evening. He's worried being seen associating with something controversial, Hannah said. Yes. What would change that? Cole thought about it. Things stopped being controversial, which means if we become established enough that associating with us is normal rather than a risk. She looked at him. How long do you need to hold out if Addison doesn't renew? 1 season. Maybe 2 if the spring prices are reasonable. Can you do that? Yes, it'll be tight, but yes. Hannah nodded. Then we sate him out the same way we're waiting Bellamy out. Just keep being here until being here is unremarkable. Cole was quiet for a moment. You know what the worst part is? He's not a bad man, Addison. He's just someone who follows the weather. Most people follow the weather, Hannah said. That's not a character flaw. It's just physics. You don't fight physics, you change the climate. Cole looked at her. He did that sometimes, just looked at her for a moment, not evaluating, not performing attention, just present in a way that she'd stopped finding unsettling and started finding steadying. You've been thinking about this a long time, he said. How to change things, not just surviving them. I've had a lot of quiet evenings, she said. Think a lot on quiet evenings. February came in harder than January had, which was not unusual for the Virginia frontier, but was always slightly personally offensive, regardless of how many times you'd lived through it. The Foundation Annex had 8 families by the middle of the month. Common room was in daily use. Ada had organized a rotating kitchen schedule that had, after 2 weeks of adjustment and one significant argument about the proper way to season a pot of beans, settled into something that functioned. Earl had become, without anyone formally appointing him to anything, the de facto maintenance coordinator, a role that suited him in the way that roles suited people when they discovered that what they were good at was also something that was needed. His 8-year-old son had become inseparable from Peter, which was something nobody had planned, and which produced, on a daily basis, a kind of harmless, low-level chaos that Hannah had come to regard as evidence that the place was alive. She thought about that sometimes, what alive looked like in a place, how different it was from functional. Poorhouse on Crow's Road had been functional for years. What was happening at the Foundation property now was something else. People were arguing about bean seasoning. Children were running where they shouldn't and being yelled at and running again. Ada was maintaining 3 simultaneous minor feuds with various residents over violations of her kitchen's schedule, while also being the person those same residents came to when something was genuinely wrong. It was Messi's and imperfect and irreducibly human. Hannah had spent 3 years trying to make invisible an operation that she'd thought would be contaminated by being seen. She understood now that visibility wasn't contamination. The mess was not a failure. The mess was people, and people were what she'd been trying to help all along. Robert Bellamy's survey dispute was resolved in the 3rd week of February. Greer presented the original land records, county survey maps from 1871, deed of trust documentation, and a sworn statement from the surveyor, who had done the original boundary work and was, at 81 years old, still alive, still sharp, and considerably annoyed at having his professional work disputed by what he called, in his sworn statement, a politically motivated pencil drawing. The commission reviewed everything over the course of 3 days. Judge Price who had spent the intervening weeks visibly calculating which direction the county's sympathies had settled, signed the ruling confirming the original boundary line. The 4 acres that Silas Crane's counter-survey had placed in the disputed zone were confirmed as foundation property. The well was foundation property. The cleared field was foundation property. Greer sent Hannah a 1-line note. It held. She was in the middle of a supply inventory when Peter brought the note. She read it, set it down, finished the inventory, and then went outside and stood in the cold February air for a few minutes by herself, looking at the pine trees on the property line. She didn't cry. She wasn't a person who cried easily, and she had spent long enough managing her own emotional responses in situations where displaying them had not been safe that the reflex had become habitual. But she felt the thing that a long, sustained effort reaching a necessary resolution feels like not triumph. Exactly. Because triumph implies a clear defeated opponent and a clean finish line, and this was neither. It was more like the release of a pressure she'd been holding. So long, she'd partially forgotten it was there. The pine trees moved in the wind. Somewhere behind her, the 8-year-old was yelling something at Peter's 8-year-old companion that sounded like a dispute over the wooden top. She went back inside. Cole found out about the ruling from Greer at the same time Hannah did. He rode to the foundation property that afternoon, and she told him it had held, and he said good, and they stood in the common room for a moment with the particular slightly awkward quality of 2 people who have been through something together and are now on the other side of it and are figuring out what that means. Addison renewed, Cole said. She looked at him. When? Before I heard about the ruling. He said he'd been thinking about it and decided that a man's ranching record speaks for itself. What changed his mind? Probably the ruling. Word travels fast in this county. Physics, Hannah said. What? Climate change. He almost smiled. There it was, that almost, which she had stopped waiting for and started simply noticing when it arrived ahead. The way you notice a particular quality of winter light that happens only at a certain angle and doesn't last long. She told him about what Cordelia had written, about the Tuesday afternoons. He listened. Will you ask her? He said. I already did. She starts next week. He nodded. Greer mentioned he'd be willing to come to a board meeting once a quarter at no charge. I think he likes the work. Greer likes being right, Hannah said. This situation has given him several opportunities to be right. It has, Cole agreed. They were quiet for a moment. Outside, Earl was directing a repair to the annex roof he'd identified, a section of shingles that would not survive another hard rain, and he'd organized 3 of the other residents to help him fix it that afternoon, without being asked by anyone. Cole was watching through the window. I've been thinking, he said, not turning from the window. That's generally considered a good habit, Hannah said. It was what she'd said to him in the kitchen garden months ago, the first time he'd come to her with a practical proposal. He'd heard the echo in it. She could tell by the slight shift in his posture. I've been thinking, he said again, with a small adjustment in his tone that acknowledged the reference, about Margaret, about what she would have said if she'd seen how this went. Hannah waited. She would have said I took too long to get started. He turned from the window. She would have been right. You started when you started, Hannah said. That's all any of us do. You started earlier. I started from a different place, a different kind of necessity. She held his gaze. Not a moral distinction, Cole. It's just geography. He was quiet for a moment. I want to ask you something. Go ahead. When the immediate crisis is past, and the foundation is stable, and Bellamy has moved on to whatever he moves on to, what do you want? For yourself. Not for the operation. For you. It was a question nobody had asked her in so long that the shape of it was briefly disorienting. Not unkindly, just unfamiliar. The way a room looks different when someone moves a piece of furniture you've stopped seeing. She thought about it genuinely. She owed him that. I want to stay, she said, here in this county, doing this work. She paused. I want the foundation to get large enough that it doesn't depend entirely on me and Ada. I want other people to be running it in 10 years and doing it better than we did. That's for the operation, I know. She looked at him. The rest of it I haven't thought about as clearly. I've been aiming at the next 6 weeks for so long that further than that is still a little blurry. That's fair. What do you want? She asked. Since you're asking. He considered this with the seriousness he applied to things that deserved it. I want what I've got, he said. The ranch. This. The sense that what I'm doing is connected to something. A pause. And I'd like to keep riding over here without needing a formal reason. Hannah looked at him steadily. You never needed a formal reason. I wasn't certain of that. You could have asked. I'm asking now then. Yes, she said, come when you want. You're always useful, if nothing else. And occasionally you're better than useful. It was not a declaration. They were both too careful and too honest for declarations at this stage of things. Two people who had each been independently self-sufficient for long enough that the idea of openly needing someone required a particular kind of bravery that was different from the bravery of standing up at a county assembly. But it was real, and they both knew it was real, and that was enough for where they were. Robert Bellamy did not surrender. Men like Robert Bellamy didn't surrender, they recalculated. What happened over the following months was a gradual withdrawal rather than a defeat. He stopped the survey pressure after the ruling. He eventually replaced Aldridge's lost advertising revenue, which meant the newspaper was no longer operating under his thumb in quite the same way it had been, not because Robert had become generous, but because he'd decided the return on that particular leverage wasn't worth the maintenance cost. He attended the next county assembly in the spring and made no reference to the foundation or to Hannah or to Cole, which was the loudest thing he could have said given the previous year. He did not apologize. He was never going to apologize. Hannah had understood that from the beginning and had made her peace with it, not the warm peace of forgiveness, which she hadn't been asked for and didn't feel obligated to perform, but the practical peace of a woman who has decided that the amount of mental space she allocates to a person who tried to destroy her should be strictly proportional to how much of a current threat he poses. He posed a diminishing threat. She allocated diminishing space. Found, in the months that followed, was that the absence of the immediate crisis revealed something she hadn't fully anticipated. She liked the work. Not in the exhausted, driven way she'd liked it when it was underground and sustained purely by necessity. She liked it in the way that people like work, when it fits the shape of who they actually are, when the skills they have and the problems that need solving line up in a way that feels, most days, not like sacrifice, but like purpose. Ada remained Ada, difficult, indispensable, gradually and grudgingly moving from tolerance of Hannah to something that would never be called warmth, but was perhaps its functional equivalent, argued regularly. They were better at the work because they argued, because neither of them was willing to defer to the other just to avoid friction, and the friction produced, more often than not, a better answer than either of them had arrived at alone. Cordelia Voss attended board meetings on Tuesday afternoons and was, as advertised, completely without patience for nonsense. She had also, Hannah discovered, a dry and unexpected humor that emerged without warning and could be devastating in the most useful possible way during discussions that were going in circles. Hannah found herself, on several occasions, looking forward to Tuesdays. Greer came once a quarter and was always right, which he maintained the dignity not to point out, and which Hannah privately appreciated more than she told him. The spring brought the kitchen garden into the cleared field, which Earl managed with the focused determination of a man who had farmed before, and understood the pleasure and the obligation of putting things in the ground and watching them come up. His wife, whose chest infection had cleared through the winter under the doctor's reduced-rate care, turned out to know more about kitchen garden design than anyone else at the foundation, and she and Hannah spent a March afternoon walking the field together, staking out rows, arguing about where to put the beans, reaching a compromise that was, as it generally was when two capable women argued about beans, better than either of them had originally proposed. 8-year-old boy helped plant seeds with the earnest, haphazard enthusiasm of someone who has been told his contribution matters and has decided to contribute as enthusiastically as possible. Several seeds went in sideways. Several went in too deep. Some went exactly right. It was a reasonable first attempt. Hannah knelt next to him at one point and showed him how to check the depth with his finger. He tried it, got it right on the second attempt, and looked up at her with the particular expression of a child who has just successfully done a real thing. "That," he said. "Just like that," she said. She moved on to the next row. He moved with her, checking depths. It was the most ordinary moment in the world. Kept thinking about it afterward, not because anything significant had happened in it, but because the ordinariness of it was what had made it significant. 3 years of walking in the dark, alone, leaving bread at a door. And now this, a child learning to plant seeds in the Foundation's first kitchen garden in the morning light, while his father fixed the annex roof and his mother argued productively about beam placement, while Ada ran a kitchen schedule with an iron hand that half the residents resented and all of them depended on, while Peter organized a delivery and Cordelia prepared notes for Tuesday and Greer sharpened his pen in the county seat. Not perfect, not finished, just alive. Cole came by on a Saturday morning in April, when the kitchen garden was beginning to show its first green suggestions above the soil. Tentative, improbable, real. He stood at the garden fence with Hannah for a while, both of them looking at the rows. Addison told me last week that he's recommended Ryder Ranch to 2 other buyers in the next county, Cole said. So the climate changed. Seems that way. Hannah looked at the green rows. Earl says we'll have beans by July if the weather holds. The weather never holds, I know. But some of them will make it. Cole was quiet for a moment. The April morning was mild and clear. One of those days the frontier occasionally offered, as if to acknowledge, that it was capable of something other than hostility, without making any promises about tomorrow. Pine trees at the property line were a different, brighter green than they'd been through the winter. Somewhere in the annex, the 8-year-old was conducting what sounded like a vigorous argument about the rules of a game that seemed to have been invented that morning. Margaret used to say, Cole started and then stopped. Hannah waited. She used to say that the problem with people wasn't that they were selfish. It was that they had a too small idea of who counted as theirs. Too small circle. That's all. Expand the circle and most people would do what needed doing. Hannah thought about that. She wasn't wrong. No, she wasn't. Is that what you think happened here? People expanded the circle? Cole considered it honestly. I think some did. I think some still haven't. I think Robert Bellamy's circle is approximately the size of his property line, and probably always will be. He glanced at her. I think you've been operating with the largest circle I've ever seen for longer than anyone knew about it, on nothing but your own wages and your own conviction. It wasn't conviction, Hannah said. At the beginning it was just I saw what was needed, and I was there, and nobody else was doing it. It's not heroic. That's just proximity. A lot of people were proximate, Cole said. You were the only one who walked 3 miles in the dark twice a week for 3 years. She didn't have an answer for that. She was quiet for a moment, watching the green rows. Think, she said finally, that the thing nobody talks about honestly enough is that it costs something. Helping costs something. Not just money and time it costs you emotionally. You see things you can't unsee. You know things about how bad it gets for people that you can't unknow. And you have to decide whether the cost is worth it not once, but over and over, every time you're tired, or afraid, or the Bellamys of the world are building something to shut you down. And is it, Cole said, worth it? She looked at the garden. Improbable green. At Earl's 11-year-old, who had appeared from somewhere, and was now crouching at the end of the closest row, examining something in the soil with the total absorbed attention of a child who has found something interesting. Yes, she said. Even when it's not, yes. Cole nodded. He understood that the way a thing could be worth it even in the moments when it didn't feel that way, because worth wasn't a feeling. Worth was a determination you made and remade, every time, until it became the kind of thing you simply were. He understood it because he'd arrived at his own version of it, not through 3 years of walking in the dark, but through a shorter and more disorganized path that had begun with a gap in a fence near a birch stand, and a woman moving through the night with a cloth sack, and the unhurried purpose of someone who knew exactly where she was going, followed her in the end. Not because she'd asked him to, because she had shown him something he hadn't known he'd lost the direction of. That was worth more than he had a clean way to say, so he didn't try to say it cleanly. He just stood at the garden fence on an April morning and watched the green come up from the ground. And Hannah stood beside him, and neither of them needed the moment to be anything other than what it was. County Assembly that autumn was different from any that had preceded it, not dramatically. Not in the way of stories where everything resolves in a single grand gesture that leaves no ambiguity. Carver County was a real place full of real people who were complicated and fallible and mostly just trying to get through their seasons. And real places don't resolve like that, but it was different. The Foundation sent 3 representatives to present a formal report on its first year of recognized operations. Hannah, Ada, and Cordelia, who sat at the front of the room rather than 3 rows back and had the settled, proprietary air of a woman who has decided this is her business now and intends to treat it accordingly. Report was 12 pages. Hannah had written most of it, Ada had corrected her on 4 operational details, and Cordelia had edited the language of the section, addressed to the commission, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been navigating official bodies for 30 years and knew exactly which words landed and which ones created unnecessary friction. 11 families assisted during the year. 43 individuals who had passed through the Foundation's programs were currently living independently in the county. The kitchen garden had produced, by July, enough surplus to supply 1/3 of the poorhouse kitchen's vegetable needs. Through summer the weather had not held, but enough of the garden had made it. Judge Price listened to the report. He asked 3 questions, all of them reasonable. He thanked the representatives. Robert Bellamy sat near the back of the room. He had come to the assembly because not coming would have been a more visible statement than coming, and Robert still understood optics even when the optics had turned against him. He did not speak during the Foundation's presentation. He did not catch Hannah's eye. When the session ended and the room began to disperse, Hannah was gathering her papers when she heard footsteps stop beside her. She looked up. It was Gideon. He was not there on Robert's business. She could tell that immediately from his posture the professional indifference was gone, and what replaced it was something quieter and less armored. "Miss Whitaker," he said. "Gideon." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been at the Bellamy house 14 years. Something in the way he said it made her think of Clara Bellamy in the schoolroom doorway. "I've been here 14 years, I know," Hannah said. "I'm considering," he said carefully, "a change." She looked at him. He was not asking for anything specific. He was not quite asking for anything at all. He was, in the way of a man who has spent his professional life being other people's instrument, indicating a direction without fully committing to the step. The Foundation has operational needs that are growing faster than our current capacity, Hannah said. If you're ever looking for work that uses your organizational abilities, I'd suggest talking to Ada Marsh. Difficult to work for and expects a great deal. She also knows more about what actually needs doing in this county than anyone I've met. Gideon considered this. "Ada Marsh," he said. "Yes." He nodded once, with the economical precision that was apparently simply his way. "Thank you, Miss Whitaker." He walked away. She watched him go. She thought that was how change actually moved through a place. Not in the large public moments, though those mattered. In the smaller ones, in the moments when a person who had been standing in someone else's arrangement for 14 years quietly decided they were ready to stand somewhere different. Cole was waiting outside when she came out, leaning against the post at the top of the Assembly Hall steps in the October afternoon, hat on, watching the county go about its business in the street below. Stood beside him. "How'd it go?" he said. "Well," Price was reasonable. Cordelia was formidable. Ada corrected 2 of my figures in front of the commission. And she was right both times, which I've decided to consider a feature rather than a problem. Cole almost smiled. There it was. Addison's wife introduced herself to me afterward, Hannah said. She asked about the kitchen garden. She wants to donate seed stock for next spring. Physics, Cole said. Climate's changed. Below them, the county moved through its afternoon, the feed store, the livery, the sound of horses and voices, and the particular October light that turned everything slightly golden before the sun dropped behind the ridge. An ordinary day on the frontier, which was to say a day with 10 kinds of difficulty, and 1 or 2 moments that made the difficulty worth the trouble. Hannah had learned to look for the moments. She'd learned that they didn't come announced, and they didn't last, and that the looking for them was itself a practice, not optimism, which was a disposition you either had or didn't, but attention. The deliberate choice to pay attention to what was survivable and useful, and occasionally, unexpectedly, worth the trouble. She thought about all the Tuesday and Friday nights, the dark roads, the cloth sacks, the tiny birds drawn on folded notes, left at doors, found by people who had needed to know that someone they'd never met had seen them and thought they were worth the walk. She hadn't done it because she was brave. She'd done it because she'd been there, and it had needed doing, and the cost of looking away had been, to her, higher than the cost of going. That was the thing she wished someone had told her, was ordinary, that most of the good that happened in the world happened exactly like that. Not from heroes with a clear sense of destiny, from people who were simply in the right place and chose not to walk past it. The frontier would keep testing, the droughts would come, and the winters would come, and men like Robert Bellamy would keep making their calculations and pursuing their interests, and doing what people with small circles did when they encountered something that challenged the circumference of their world. And there would be people who walked in the dark with bread, who kept records, who fixed leaning shelves and cleared flues, and argued about bean placement, and taught children how to check seed depth with one finger, who showed up, imperfect and tired, and sometimes afraid, and did the thing anyway. She intended to be one of those people for as long as she was able. Ready, Cole said. Yes, Hannah said. They walked down the steps together into the October afternoon, and the county went on around them, and the pine trees on the ridge held their color a little longer in the fading light before the dark came down, the way they always did, not forever, but long enough to mat the